Police find little girl on ship. Dad lent me to his friend and he did this. Everyone in tears. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. On a foggy morning at the port, Coast Guard officer Daniel Brooks received an unusual call that would change everything. Dock workers at Pier 7 had reported hearing a child crying somewhere, aboard the cargo ship Northern Horizon, a massive vessel that had just completed a 15-day journey across multiple ports. Daniel grabbed his gear and headed to the pier, his boots echoing against the wet wooden planks as seagulls circled overhead. The ship loomed large against the gray sky, its hull covered in rust and salt residue from weeks at sea. As Daniel climbed the metal ladder to board, his mind raced with possibilities. Lost child? Stowaway? The crying had stopped by the time he reached the deck, but the workers pointed him toward the lower cargo hold. Daniel descended the narrow metal stairs, flashlight in hand, calling out gently so as not to startle anyone who might be hiding. The air below deck was thick with the smell of diesel fuel and damp wood. Between stacks of shipping containers and wooden crates, he finally spotted her. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, sat perched on a wooden crate marked with faded shipping labels. Her clothes were drenched with sea spray, her small hands covered in grease from the machinery around her, and her face streaked with dried tears. What struck Daniel most was her posture, hunched over as if trying to make herself invisible, and her stomach, distended in a way that immediately concerned him. He approached slowly, kneeling down to her eye level. The girl didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the metal floor. Daniel spoke softly, introducing himself, explaining he was there to help. After a long moment of silence, she whispered in a voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear. The girl said that someone she called her dad's friend had told her to swallow everything in silence, to not make noise, to not bother the crew working above. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He asked gently who had done this to her, who had brought her here, why she was alone. The little girl clutched at her torn shirt, her fingers trembling. She seemed afraid even to breathe too loudly, as if the simple act of existing might bring punishment. Daniel could see the fear in her eyes, a deep terror that no child should ever know. He radioed for immediate backup, calling in the emergency child services protocol while trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring for the girl's sake. Within minutes, his team arrived with medical supplies and thermal blankets. Daniel carefully wrapped the girl in a blanket, feeling how cold and thin she was beneath the fabric. The ship's crew gathered nearby, their faces confused and concerned. The captain approached Daniel, insisting that no child had been registered as a passenger or mentioned in any cargo manifest. The crew members were questioned one by one. None of them had seen the girl before this moment. One sailor mentioned that the cargo hold where she was found had been loaded at their departure port and hadn't been opened since. Another crew member recalled hearing odd sounds a few days ago, but assumed it was rats or shifting cargo. Daniel's team searched the area where the girl had been hiding and found a small space between crates where she had apparently been staying. There were empty water bottles, food wrappers from crew rations that suggested she had been scavenging, and a dirty blanket. The ship's medical officer, a middle-aged man named Rodriguez, examined the girl right there on deck while Daniel stayed close to provide comfort. Rodriguez's expression grew grave as he checked her vital signs. Severe dehydration, hypothermia despite the relatively warm weather, suggesting prolonged exposure to cold conditions below deck. Most concerning was the visible malnutrition. The distended stomach that Daniel had noticed was a classic sign of prolonged hunger, where the body begins retaining fluids because it's not receiving adequate nutrition. Rodriguez explained quietly to Daniel that the girl had likely been without proper food for many days, possibly more than a week. She needed immediate hospital care. An ambulance was called to meet them at the dock. As they waited, Daniel sat beside the girl, who still hadn't given her name. He didn't push her to talk, just stayed present, letting her know she was safe now. When the ambulance arrived, the girl grabbed Daniel's hand tightly, afraid of being separated from the first person who had shown her genuine kindness. Daniel promised he would stay with her, and he kept that promise, riding in the ambulance to the hospital. At the emergency room, doctors immediately began treatment for dehydration and malnutrition. The girl was given fluids through an IV and carefully monitored as her body began the slow process of recovery. Child Services was notified, and a social worker named Patricia arrived to begin the difficult process of figuring out who this child was and how she had ended up alone on a cargo ship. During the initial examination, a nurse found something in the pocket of the girl's torn shirt. It was a crumpled piece of paper, worn from being handled many times. The note was brief, written in hurried handwriting with several crossed-out words. The message was heartbreaking in its simplicity. A father writing that he couldn't take care of his daughter anymore, asking whoever found the note to please help her get somewhere better, somewhere she deserved to be. The note was signed simply with the initial T. Daniel photographed the note carefully, making sure to preserve it as evidence while also recognizing it as a crucial piece of this mystery. Who was T? Why had he given up his daughter in such a dangerous, irresponsible way? The questions multiplied with each passing hour. Patricia, the social worker, sat with the girl once she was stable, speaking in a gentle voice, asking simple questions. Finally, after much coaxing and patience, the girl whispered her name. Emma. Just Emma. She didn't know her last name or claimed not to remember it. When asked about her father, Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She described him as sad, always sad, especially after her mommy went away. Emma didn't understand what went away meant, but she knew her mother wasn't coming back. She remembered living in a small house that was cold in winter because the heater didn't work. She remembered her father sitting at a table with his head in his hands, remembered him saying words she didn't understand about money and debt and failure. Emma spoke in fragments, the memories of a child trying to make sense of an adult world that had treated her cruelly. Daniel listened from the doorway, his jaw clenched. He had seen many difficult cases in his years with the Coast Guard, but something about Emma's quiet resignation to her suffering struck him deeply. This wasn't just neglect. This was a systematic failure of support systems that should have caught this family before it reached such a desperate point. The hospital staff worked to stabilize Emma's condition over the next 48 hours. Slowly, her body began to respond to proper nutrition and hydration. The dangerous swelling in her stomach began to reduce as her system processed actual food again. But while her physical wounds were beginning to heal, the emotional trauma was clearly profound. Emma rarely spoke unless directly questioned, and even then, her answers were brief and quiet. She flinched at sudden movements and seemed perpetually afraid of being punished for existing. Daniel returned to the cargo ship with his investigative team to conduct a thorough search. They needed to understand exactly how Emma had gotten aboard and who had put her there. The crew was cooperative but clearly shaken by the discovery. The captain provided access to all security footage from the port of departure. Hours of video were reviewed, frame by frame, looking for any sign of a child being brought aboard. Finally, they found something. 3 days before the ship's departure, security cameras captured a man and a small child near the cargo loading area. The image quality wasn't perfect, but the child's size and clothing matched Emma. The man with her wasn't walking her toward any passenger boarding area. Instead, he was speaking with a port worker near the cargo containers being loaded onto the northern horizon. Money appeared to change hands, though the angle made it difficult to confirm. The port worker was identified through employee records as Marcus Chen, a temporary laborer who had been hired for that specific loading job. When Daniel's team tried to locate Marcus, they discovered he had left the job immediately after the ship departed and hadn't reported for any subsequent work assignments. His listed address turned out to be a temporary rental that he had already vacated. Marcus had effectively disappeared, but now they had a face and a name. A warrant was issued for his questioning. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Emma was slowly opening up to Patricia. She described bits and pieces of the days before being left on the ship. Her father had packed a small bag with her favorite stuffed animal, a worn rabbit with one missing ear. He had driven her for hours in a car that made strange noises. Emma remembered feeling excited at first, thinking they were going on an adventure. Her father kept saying things like, "You deserve better and I'm not enough for you." At the time, Emma didn't understand these were goodbyes disguised as promises. When they reached the port, Emma's father met with a man he called his friend. Emma didn't recognize this friend and felt uncomfortable around him. Her father knelt down, hugged her tightly, and told her to be brave, that she was going to meet some very nice people who would take good care of her. Emma remembered crying, begging to stay with him, but her father had gently pried her hands away and handed her to the man. That was the last time Emma saw her father. The man, who Emma would later identify as Marcus from a photo lineup, had not been kind. He told her to be quiet, to hide when told, to not cause problems. He had led her into the cargo area of the ship and pointed to a space between crates. He gave her a few bottles of water and some crackers, told her the ship was going somewhere better and that someone would come get her when they arrived. Then he left, and Emma heard the heavy cargo door close. For days, Emma stayed in that space, too frightened to explore much, rationing her meager supplies. She heard the crew working above, heard the ship's engines roar to life, felt the motion as they left port. She waited for someone to come for her, as the man had promised, but no one came. The water ran out, the crackers ran out. Emma tried calling for help a few times, but her voice was too small to carry over the engine noise, and she was terrified of getting in trouble. She remembered her father's friend's warning to stay silent, so she endured, growing weaker each day, until finally her body gave out and she couldn't help but cry. That crying, heard by the dock workers when the ship finally arrived at port, saved her life. Daniel compiled all this information into a report that was both thorough and emotionally devastating to write. The case was no longer just about finding Emma's father. It was about understanding how social systems failed this family so completely that abandonment seemed like the only option to a desperate parent. Child Protective Services began searching databases for any family matching Emma's description. The note's initial T was the starting point. Cross-referencing recent missing persons reports, welfare cases, and eviction records from counties within driving distance of the departure port, they began to narrow down possibilities. 3 weeks after Emma's rescue, a breakthrough came. A rural county sheriff's office responded to the inquiry with information about a Thomas Whitfield, a widower who had been living with his young daughter in a deteriorating farmhouse about 200 miles from the departure port. Neighbors had reported not seeing the pair for several weeks. When sheriff's deputies checked the property, they found it abandoned. Inside the house, they found signs of severe poverty: empty cupboards, disconnected utilities, eviction notices piled on a table. They also found photographs. A family of 3, a mother, father, and young daughter, smiling in happier times. The daughter in the photos was unmistakably Emma, though healthier and happier than the child Daniel had found on the ship. The father in the photos matched the grainy security footage from the port. Thomas Whitfield was Emma's father. Now, they just had to find him. The investigation into Thomas Whitfield's background revealed a tragic downward spiral. He had been a farm equipment mechanic making a modest but stable living. His wife, Sarah, had worked part-time at a local school cafeteria. Together, they managed to provide for Emma's needs, though money was always tight. 3 years ago, Sarah developed a medical condition that required ongoing treatment. Without adequate health insurance, the family's medical debt mounted quickly. Sarah tried to continue working, but her health deteriorated. She passed away 18 months before Emma's rescue, leaving Thomas emotionally shattered and financially devastated. Thomas attempted to continue working, but grief and depression made it difficult to maintain employment. He lost his job, fell behind on rent, and began the cruel descent into poverty that traps so many families. County records showed that Thomas had contacted social services twice, asking about assistance programs. He had inquired about temporary foster care, not to abandon Emma, but to ensure she had food and shelter while he got back on his feet. However, the system's bureaucracy was overwhelming. Applications required documentation Thomas didn't have. Wait times were months long. The few support groups available were oversubscribed. Faced with the slow-turning wheels of official help and the immediate reality of an eviction notice and an empty refrigerator, Thomas had made a terrible decision born of desperation. He had somehow connected with Marcus Chen, possibly through word of mouth in the community of people struggling at society's margins. Marcus had apparently promised to help Emma reach a better situation, perhaps suggesting connections to families looking to adopt, or organizations that could place her quickly. Thomas, in his desperation and depression, had believed this promise. He had convinced himself that giving Emma to a stranger who promised to help was better than watching her suffer through homelessness with him. It was a decision made from a place of profound pain and distorted thinking, not malice. But understanding the reasoning didn't diminish the harm caused. Emma had suffered tremendously because of that choice. Now, authorities needed to find Thomas, both to hold him accountable and to understand the full scope of what had happened. A multi-state alert was issued for Thomas Whitfield. His photo was distributed to law enforcement agencies, shelters, and social service organizations. For weeks, there was no trace of him. Some feared the worst, that overcome with guilt and grief, Thomas might have harmed himself after abandoning Emma. Then, 2 months after Emma's rescue, a call came from a bus station 400 miles away. A ticket agent had recognized Thomas from a distributed flyer. He had been living rough, sleeping in the station and working odd jobs for cash, staying just mobile enough to avoid being moved along by security. When local police approached Thomas, he didn't run. He simply sat down on a bench and began to cry. Officers reported that he asked immediately about Emma, whether she was alive, whether she was safe. When told she had been found and was receiving care, Thomas collapsed in relief and grief. He was taken into custody, not roughly but with an understanding that this was a man who had broken under circumstances that might have broken many people. During his interview with investigators, Thomas provided a fuller picture of his actions. He explained that he had truly believed Marcus's promises that Emma would be placed with a good family quickly. He hadn't known Marcus planned to put her on a ship, hadn't known she would be hidden and forgotten in a cargo hold. Marcus had told him the ship was going to a port city with better social services, that he knew people there who helped children in need. Thomas had been too desperate, too defeated, to question the story critically. He admitted he knew it was wrong, knew he was taking an enormous risk with his daughter's safety, but he had convinced himself that any chance at a better life for Emma was worth it. He couldn't bear watching her go hungry anymore, couldn't stand the shame of being unable to provide. In his distorted thinking, giving her up felt like the only loving choice left to him. After leaving Emma with Marcus, Thomas had wandered, unable to return to the empty farmhouse, unable to stay in the community where everyone would know what he had done. He had worked when he could find work, sent small anonymous donations to children's charities, and essentially waited to be found. He expressed no desire to avoid consequences, only asked repeatedly about Emma's well-being. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally wrenching. Thomas was charged with child endangerment and neglect. The prosecutor's office, however, recognized the unusual circumstances of the case. This wasn't a typical neglect case driven by substance use or intentional cruelty. This was a case of systemic failure, poverty, untreated mental health crisis, and a desperately misguided decision. A plea agreement was reached. Thomas would serve a suspended sentence contingent on completing parenting classes, maintaining mental health treatment, and participating in supervised visitation with Emma if and when she expressed willingness to see him. The focus shifted from punishment to rehabilitation, and possibly eventual family reunification, though that would depend entirely on Emma's healing process and wishes. Meanwhile, Emma herself was slowly recovering. She had been placed in a therapeutic foster home run by Marianne Hartley, a woman in her early 60s with decades of experience caring for children who had experienced various forms of crisis. Marianne's home was warm and predictable, with routines that helped Emma feel safe. For the first few weeks, Emma barely spoke and struggled to eat regular meals. Her body had adapted to starvation, and reintroducing food had to be done carefully under medical supervision. Marianne never pushed Emma to talk about what had happened, instead focusing on the present moment. showing Emma through actions that this place was safe, that she wouldn't be abandoned again, that there was enough food and warmth and care to go around. Slowly, incrementally, Emma began to emerge from her shell. She started playing with the toys in Marianne's home. She began helping with small tasks like setting the table or folding laundry, seemingly finding comfort in being useful. She started attending a local school, where patient teachers worked with her to address the educational gaps created by her family's instability. Daniel checked in regularly, having become personally invested in Emma's case. He attended case review meetings and visited when appropriate, always amazed at the resilience Emma showed. Children, he reflected, had a remarkable capacity for healing when given the right support, but they also carried scars that might never fully disappear. 5 months after the rescue, Emma's therapy team suggested it might be time to address the question of her father directly. Emma had been told, in age-appropriate terms, that her father had been found and wanted to know she was okay. Emma's initial reaction was complex, a mixture of longing, anger, confusion, and fear. She spent several sessions with her therapist working through her feelings. She drew pictures of her father, of the house they had lived in, of the ship. She talked about missing him, but also about feeling hurt that he had left her. She expressed fear that if she saw him again, he might leave her somewhere else. These were reasonable fears, and her care team was careful not to rush her toward any decision. They made clear that whether or when she saw her father was entirely up to her, that she had control in this situation. After weeks of consideration and therapeutic preparation, Emma said she wanted to know why. Why had her father given her to the stranger? Why had he told her she was going somewhere better when he was really sending her somewhere frightening? Why hadn't he kept her with him? These questions couldn't be answered by her therapist or Marianne or Daniel. Only Thomas could answer them, if Emma was willing to hear. A carefully supervised meeting was arranged. It would take place in a neutral location, a family counseling center designed for exactly these kinds of difficult reunifications. Marianne would be present, as would Emma's therapist and a social worker. Thomas would be brought in separately with his own support person. The meeting would proceed only as far as Emma felt comfortable, with her having the power to end it at any time. The night before the scheduled meeting, Emma couldn't sleep. Marianne sat with her, reading stories and reminding her that tomorrow she only had to do what felt right to her, nothing more. Emma fell asleep eventually, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had been in her bag when her father left her with Marcus, one of the few possessions that had followed her through her ordeal. The next morning, Emma was quiet during the drive to the counseling center. When they arrived, she held tightly to Marianne's hand as they walked into the building. The meeting room was comfortable and informal, with soft furniture and warm lighting designed to reduce anxiety. Emma sat on a couch next to Marianne, her therapist in a nearby chair. After a few minutes of gentle preparation, Thomas was brought in. When Thomas saw Emma, his composure immediately crumbled. Tears streamed down his face, and his entire body seemed to shake with suppressed sobs. But he didn't rush toward her, didn't try to hug her or touch her. He understood, perhaps for the first time truly understood, that he had lost the right to that easy affection through his actions. He sat in the chair indicated by the social worker, several feet away from Emma, and waited. Emma stared at her father, this man who was both familiar and somehow a stranger now. She saw how much thinner he looked, how much older, the weight of guilt and grief visible in every line of his face. The room was silent for a long moment, everyone waiting to see what Emma would do or say. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice small but clear. She asked the question that had been burning in her heart for months. Did he leave her because she was bad? Because she was too much trouble? Because he didn't love her anymore? Thomas's response came in broken phrases, interrupted by tears. He told Emma that she was never bad, never too much, that he loved her more than anything in the world, and always had. He explained in simple terms that a child could understand, that he had been very sick in his head and heart after her mommy died, that he had lost his job and their home, and he had felt like a terrible father because he couldn't give her food or keep her warm. He told her that he made a very, very bad choice because he thought he was helping her, but he knew now that he had hurt her instead. He said he was sorrier than words could express, that what he did was wrong, that she deserved so much better than what he had done. He told Emma that whether she ever wanted to see him again was completely up to her, that he understood if she was angry and hurt, that those feelings were okay and valid. Emma listened, processing words that were still complicated for her young mind to fully grasp. But she understood the core message. Her father's actions had been about his own brokenness, not about her worth. This understanding, delivered with obvious genuine remorse, began to create a small crack in the wall of hurt Emma had built around her heart. She didn't run to her father. She didn't say she forgave him. But she did ask if he was getting help now, if he had food and a place to stay. Thomas explained that he was living in a supervised program, that he was seeing a counselor who helped him with his sad feelings, that he was learning how to be stronger. Emma nodded slowly. Then she said something that surprised everyone in the room. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small medallion that Thomas had placed there months ago, the one with her mother's picture inside. She had carried it through her entire ordeal, through the ship, the hospital, and into her new life with Marianne. She held it up and said simply that she had kept it safe like he told her to. Thomas saw the medallion, and fresh tears fell. He told Emma thank you, that keeping that safe meant the world to him, that it meant her mommy was still watching over her. The meeting lasted only 20 minutes, but it was enough for a first step. Emma didn't commit to seeing Thomas again soon, but she didn't rule it out either. As they prepared to leave, Emma paused near the door and looked back at her father. She told him she hoped he got better. It was a small offering of grace from a child who had every right to offer none, and it nearly destroyed Thomas with its generosity. Over the following months, Emma continued her therapy and slowly began to thrive in Marianne's care. She requested occasional updates about her father, but didn't ask for another meeting right away. Thomas continued his own counseling and slowly began to rebuild a functional life, always knowing that his relationship with Emma might never be fully restored, but determined to become someone worthy of her forgiveness, should she ever choose to offer it. The case against Marcus Chen eventually resulted in his arrest. He was charged with multiple counts of child endangerment and human trafficking. As investigators discovered, Emma wasn't the first child he had taken payment to transport under false pretenses. His trial brought to light a disturbing network of people who exploited desperate parents, making promises they never intended to keep, profiting from family tragedy. Marcus received a substantial prison sentence. For Daniel, Emma's case became a defining moment in his career. He had always taken his duty seriously, but seeing the direct impact of intervention, seeing Emma transform from the terrified child on the ship to the gradually healing girl in Marianne's care, reinforced why his work mattered. He became an advocate within the Coast Guard for better training on identifying signs of child trafficking and exploitation, using Emma's story, with permission and with details changed to protect her privacy, as a teaching tool for other officers. 1 year after Emma's rescue, on a mild autumn afternoon, Marianne took Emma to a community event at the local marina. It was a festival celebrating the maritime heritage of their coastal town, with boat tours, seafood, and educational exhibits. Emma had been hesitant about going near boats again, her associations with them deeply negative, but Marianne had gently encouraged her, suggesting that creating new, positive memories might help. At the marina, Emma watched families enjoying boat rides, saw children learning to tie sailors' knots, observed the community coming together in celebration. Something shifted in her understanding. The ship that had been her prison wasn't representative of all vessels or all voyages. Ships could also bring people home, could be tools of connection rather than isolation. As they walked along the dock, Emma spotted Daniel in his Coast Guard uniform, volunteering at an educational booth about water safety. She ran up to him, and he greeted her with a warm smile, remarking on how much taller she had gotten. They talked for a while, Daniel showing her some of the equipment he used in his work, explaining how the Coast Guard helped people in trouble at sea. Emma listened intently, then asked if she could see his rescue boat someday. Daniel promised they would arrange it, recognizing this request as a significant step in Emma's healing. Later that day, as the sun began to set over the water, Emma stood at the edge of the dock with Marianne, watching boats return to harbor. She reflected aloud that maybe ships weren't scary after all, that they were just transportation, and it was people who chose whether to use them for good or bad purposes. Marianne agreed, adding that Emma herself had been very brave on her journey, and now she was learning to navigate a new kind of journey, one toward healing and happiness. Emma smiled slightly, a rare but genuine expression of hope. She said she liked living with Marianne, liked her new school, and was glad Daniel had found her that day. Marianne hugged her gently, and they watched together as the last boat of the evening docked safely. 2 years after her rescue, Emma's case reached a milestone review. She had been in Marianne's care continuously, and both Emma and Marianne expressed a desire to make the arrangement permanent. Marianne officially began the process to become Emma's adoptive mother, a lengthy legal procedure, but one that everyone involved supported. Emma was thriving in school, had made friends, and while she still attended periodic therapy sessions, her progress was remarkable. The question of Thomas remained complex. Emma had agreed to occasional supervised visits, which had gradually increased from twice a year to every few months. These visits were cordial, but not deeply emotional. Emma was polite and occasionally warm, but there was a distance that might always remain. Thomas accepted this reality with grace, grateful for any contact he was permitted, knowing he had forfeited the right to expect more. He continued his own treatment and had found stable employment, slowly rebuilding his life with the understanding that his greatest purpose now was to demonstrate to Emma, through actions, not words, that people could change and grow. 3 years after the rescue, on a bright spring morning, Emma stood in Marianne's backyard helping prepare a small sailboat for the season. Marianne had bought it the previous summer, a modest vessel meant for calm water sailing, and had been teaching Emma the basics of sailing safety and technique. Emma had discovered she actually enjoyed being on the water when it was her choice, when she felt safe and in control. As they worked together, coiling ropes and checking equipment, Emma mentioned casually that she had been thinking about her father lately. Marianne paused in her work, giving Emma space to continue. Emma said she thought maybe she understood a little better now why her father had made such a bad choice. She had been learning in school about how sometimes people's brains don't work right when they're too sad or scared, how they might make decisions that don't make sense to others. She said she was still hurt by what happened, probably always would be, but she thought maybe her father had been sick in a way he couldn't help, and maybe that was a little different than if he had just been mean. Marianne listened carefully, then acknowledged that Emma's understanding was wise and mature. She explained that understanding why something happened doesn't mean Emma had to excuse it or pretend it didn't hurt, but it might help her carry the experience with less pain. Emma nodded thoughtfully, then asked if maybe at the next visit she could show her father a picture of the sailboat and tell him about learning to sail. Marianne said that would be lovely, and they continued their work in comfortable silence. The next scheduled visit between Emma and Thomas took place a few weeks later. Emma brought photos of herself on the sailboat, clearly proud of her new skill. Thomas looked at the pictures with evident emotion, telling Emma how proud he was of her courage, how amazed he was that after everything, she had found a way to love the water. Emma told him about Marianne, about school, about her friends. She talked more openly than she had in previous visits, a sign of growing confidence and healing. Toward the end of the visit, Emma said something that caught everyone off guard. She told Thomas that she was doing okay now, that she wanted him to know that. She said she hoped he was doing okay too, and that maybe someday, if he kept getting better, they could see each other more often. Not live together, Emma was clear about that, but maybe be in each other's lives in a small way. Thomas, overwhelmed, could only nod and thank her, telling her that knowing she was happy and safe was the greatest gift he could receive. As Emma and Marianne drove home after that visit, Emma was quiet but seemed at peace. Marianne asked how she was feeling, and Emma replied that it was strange, feeling sad and okay at the same time. Marianne explained that was completely normal, that healing was complicated and didn't follow a straight line. Emma accepted this, then asked what was for dinner, shifting back into the everyday concerns of a child who was learning to be a child again. 4 years after the rescue, Emma's adoption by Marianne was finalized. It was a small celebration, just Emma, Marianne, their lawyer, and a few close friends, including Daniel, who had remained a supportive presence in Emma's life. Emma, now 12 years old, stood in the courthouse and officially became Emma Hartley. She carried both the scars of her early trauma and the strength she had developed through recovery. She would always remember the ship, always carry some wariness born of that experience, but it no longer defined her entire existence. In a conversation with Daniel after the adoption ceremony, Emma reflected on her journey. She said she used to think ships only took people away from where they belonged, but now she understood that the right people and the right support could help you find your way home, even after being lost. Daniel told her that she was one of the bravest people he had ever met, and that her story had changed how he did his job, making him more aware and more committed to helping vulnerable people. Emma smiled and said she was glad something good came from it all. The story of Emma's rescue, recovery, and gradual healing became a case study in how trauma, properly addressed with patience, professional support, and genuine care, doesn't have to mean a life sentence of suffering. Emma's resilience, combined with the intervention of people like Daniel who saw her crisis and acted, and people like Marianne who provided stable, loving care, created a path forward. Thomas's story, too, became part of discussions about poverty, mental health, and the social safety nets that fail too many families. His terrible choice was never excused, but it was contextualized within systems that had failed him long before he failed Emma. In advocacy circles, Emma's case, anonymized but powerful, was used to argue for better mental health resources, more accessible family support services, and reforms to child welfare systems that too often move too slowly for families in acute crisis. As Emma entered her teenage years, she occasionally volunteered with Marianne at community organizations that helped families experiencing hardship, wanting to be part of preventing other children from experiencing what she had endured. She maintained occasional contact with Thomas, their relationship cordial, but bounded by realistic limitations. Thomas, for his part, channeled his own guilt and grief into volunteer work with support groups for parents struggling with poverty and depression, hoping to be a cautionary tale that might help others seek help before reaching the breaking point he had reached. On a warm evening 5 years after her rescue, Emma sat on the dock with Marianne, watching the sun set over the marina. A gentle breeze carried the salt smell of the ocean, and boats rocked peacefully in their slips. Emma reflected that she used to be afraid of the water, afraid of ships, afraid of so many things. But now, she said, she understood that ships themselves weren't bad. They were just vessels that went where people steered them. Some journeys were dark and frightening, but others brought you to safety, to home. Marianne squeezed her shoulder gently and agreed, adding that Emma herself had navigated the hardest journey of all, the journey from trauma to healing, from fear to hope. Emma leaned against Marianne's side, secure in the knowledge that she was loved, that she had a home, that she had survived and would continue to thrive. The ocean stretched out before them, no longer a source of terror but simply water, holding both the memory of her darkest time and the promise of all the adventures still to come. She had been lost, found, and was finally, truly home. On a foggy morning at the coastal port of Greystone Harbor, Coast Guard officer Daniel Brooks received an unusual call that would fundamentally change not just his career, but his entire understanding of duty and compassion. It was barely 6 in the morning when his radio crackled to life with an urgent message from dock workers at Pier 7. They reported hearing what sounded distinctly like a child crying somewhere aboard the Northern Horizon, a massive cargo ship that had just completed a grueling 15-day journey across multiple international ports, carrying everything from industrial machinery to agricultural supplies. Daniel grabbed his gear without hesitation, his mind already racing through protocols and possibilities as he made his way through the early morning mist that clung to the waterfront. The port was just beginning to stir with activity, Forklifts moving containers and dock workers preparing for another long day of loading and unloading. As Daniel's boots echoed against the wet wooden planks of the pier, seagulls circled overhead, their cries mixing with the sound of ships' horns in the distance. The northern horizon loomed impossibly large against the gray morning sky, its massive hull covered in layers of rust and salt residue that told stories of countless voyages across unpredictable seas. The ship's metal sides rose like a wall before him, intimidating in their sheer industrial scale. Daniel approached the accommodation ladder that had been lowered for port officials and crew, his hand instinctively checking his radio and first aid kit. As he climbed the steep metal ladder, hand over hand, the height of the vessel became even more apparent. This wasn't a pleasure craft or fishing boat. This was a working vessel designed purely for commerce, with little consideration for comfort or safety beyond the bare minimum required by maritime law. When he reached the main deck, several crew members were waiting, their faces showing a mixture of concern and confusion. The first mate, a weathered man named Kowalski, approached Daniel quickly and explained in accented English that they had been preparing to unload when two dock workers who had boarded early heard crying coming from somewhere below. The crew had searched briefly, but the labyrinthine nature of the cargo holds made it difficult to pinpoint the exact location of the sound. By the time they organized a more thorough search, the crying had stopped, leaving them uncertain whether they had imagined it or whether someone was truly in distress. Daniel didn't waste time with lengthy discussions. He asked for a crew member to guide him to the cargo areas and followed a young sailor named Martinez down narrow metal staircases that descended into the belly of the ship. The air grew noticeably cooler and more oppressive as they went lower, the mechanical hum of the ship's systems creating a constant background drone that would have masked quieter sounds. The smell down here was overwhelming. Diesel fuel, machine oil, damp wood, and the indefinable mustiness of spaces that rarely saw direct sunlight or fresh air. Martinez led Daniel through a maze of corridors past crew quarters and storage rooms until they reached the main cargo hold. The space was vast, filled with shipping containers stacked in precise rows, wooden crates of various sizes, and machinery secured with heavy chains and cables. Daniel called out gently, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, trying not to sound threatening in case someone was hiding. He moved slowly between the containers, his flashlight beam cutting through the dimness, searching for any sign of human presence. It was Martinez who spotted her first, pointing wordlessly toward a gap between two wooden crates near the bulkhead. Daniel approached carefully, his heart rate increasing as he saw what Martinez had seen. Huddled on a wooden crate marked with faded international shipping labels was a small figure. A little girl. Daniel estimated maybe 8 years old, though malnutrition might have made her appear younger than she actually was. She was sitting with her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around her legs in a posture of complete defensive withdrawal. Her clothes, which might have once been a simple t-shirt and jeans, were now drenched with sea spray and stained with the grease and grime of the cargo hold. Her blonde hair was matted and tangled, her small face streaked with dirt and the tracks of dried tears. But what struck Daniel most profoundly was her stomach, visibly distended beneath her soiled shirt, in a way that he recognized immediately from training photos and humanitarian mission briefings. This was the cruel paradox of severe malnutrition. The body, desperate and failing, begins retaining fluids in the absence of proper nutrition, creating the appearance of fullness while the person is actually starving. Daniel knelt down slowly, maintaining some distance so as not to overwhelm her, and kept his voice soft and steady as he introduced himself. He explained that he was with the Coast Guard, that he was there to help, that she was safe now. The girl didn't respond at first, didn't even lift her eyes from the floor. She remained absolutely still except for the slight trembling Daniel could see in her small shoulders. He waited patiently, not pushing, simply maintaining a calm presence and repeating gentle reassurances. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, the girl spoke. Her voice was so quiet that Daniel had to lean in to hear her over the ambient noise of the ship. What she said made his blood run cold, despite years of training and exposure to difficult situations. She whispered that someone her father had called his friend told her to swallow everything in silence, to not make any noise, to not bother the crew members who were working on the ship. The phrasing was oddly specific, almost rehearsed, as if she had been told these instructions repeatedly until they became ingrained. Daniel felt a wave of anger rising but forced it down, knowing that his emotional reaction would help no one right now. He asked gently, his voice carefully controlled, who had done this to her, who had brought her onto this ship and left her here alone in the darkness. The little girl finally lifted her eyes to meet his, and what Daniel saw there nearly broke his professional composure. It wasn't just fear, though there was plenty of that. It was resignation, a learned helplessness that suggested this child had long since stopped expecting adults to protect her. She clutched at her torn and dirty shirt with trembling fingers, her hands so thin that the bones showed clearly through the skin. She seemed genuinely afraid that even breathing too loudly might bring some form of punishment or rejection. Daniel's immediate priority was the girl's physical safety and medical condition. He radioed for backup using his portable communicator, speaking in the calm, coded language that wouldn't alarm the child while conveying urgency to his colleagues. He activated the Coast Guard's emergency protocol for found children, which would bring not just medical personnel, but also child protective services and law enforcement who specialized in cases involving minors. While waiting for his team to arrive, Daniel carefully observed the girl without touching her or moving her, aware that she might have injuries that required professional assessment before any movement. She was clearly severely dehydrated based on the sunken quality around her eyes and the dry, cracked appearance of her lips. Her breathing was shallow but steady, which was encouraging. The distended stomach was alarming but not immediately life-threatening if they could get her proper medical attention quickly. Daniel kept talking to her in a steady, reassuring stream, not requiring responses but simply filling the silence with calm human contact. He told her about the hospital where she would be taken, how there would be doctors and nurses whose entire job was to make people feel better, how there would be warm blankets and food and water, how she wouldn't have to be afraid anymore. Within 10 minutes, Daniel's team arrived. Lieutenant Sarah Chen brought the emergency medical kit and immediately began a gentle but thorough assessment, while Daniel stayed close to provide continuity and comfort for the girl. Paramedic James Wilson set up portable monitoring equipment to check vital signs. Two other officers, Rodriguez and Patterson, began documenting the scene with photographs and measurements while also interviewing the ship's crew to establish a timeline. The ship's captain, a Lithuanian man named Volkov, arrived looking genuinely shocked and troubled. He approached Daniel and Captain Chen, insisting emphatically that no child had been registered as a passenger on any of the manifests, that the crew roster showed no families or dependents, that company policy strictly forbade unauthorized persons aboard cargo vessels. His confusion appeared genuine, which meant either someone had smuggled the girl aboard without official knowledge, or the captain himself was complicit and an excellent actor. Daniel's instinct, honed by years of reading people in crisis situations, suggested the former. Volkov seemed as disturbed by this discovery as anyone. The crew members were gathered and questioned individually. One by one, they all told the same story. None of them had seen the girl before this moment. The ship had left from the port of Alexandria, Virginia, 15 days ago, made brief stops in Charleston, Savannah, and Jacksonville for cargo operations, and finally arrived here at Greystone Harbor. Any of those ports could have been where the girl came aboard, or she could have been hidden in the original cargo loaded in Alexandria. One older sailor, a man with decades of sea experience named Jurgens, mentioned almost apologetically that he had heard odd sounds 3 or 4 days ago while doing routine checks in the cargo areas. He had assumed it was rats, which were an unfortunately common problem on cargo ships despite best efforts at prevention, or perhaps cargo shifting with the ship's movement. Now, in retrospect, he realized with visible horror that he might have heard the girl and dismissed it. The guilt on his face was evident, though Daniel reassured him that sounds in cargo holds were notoriously difficult to interpret and that he had responded appropriately to what he believed at the time to be a common shipboard issue. A thorough search of the specific area where the girl had been found revealed more about her ordeal. Between and behind the wooden crates, investigators found what was clearly a makeshift living space of sorts. There were 6 empty plastic water bottles, the kind typically stocked in crew vending machines or storage areas. Someone had either given her these bottles, or she had somehow accessed areas where supplies were kept and taken them herself. Food wrappers suggested she had eaten, or at least attempted to eat, protein bars, crackers, and dried fruit. Again, the kind of non-perishable items that would be found in emergency supplies or crew storage. A thin, filthy blanket was wadded in the corner, suggesting she had tried to create some warmth and comfort in the cold metal environment. Most heartbreaking was a small stuffed animal, a rabbit with one ear completely missing, and the other hanging by threads, clutched among her few belongings. This toy, clearly beloved and well-worn even before this ordeal, represented a connection to a life before this nightmare. A reminder that this child had once been cared for, had once had someone who gave her toys and presumably love. The ship's medical officer, a man named Rodriguez who had basic emergency medical training required for cargo vessels but was not a doctor, performed an initial examination right there on the deck while the area was secured and privacy screens were erected. His expression grew increasingly grave as he checked her vital signs and condition. He confirmed severe dehydration based on skin elasticity tests and mucous membrane appearance. He noted clear signs of hypothermia, with her core body temperature several degrees below normal, despite the relatively mild weather, indicating she had been exposed to the unheated cargo hold for an extended period. Most concerning was the obvious and severe malnutrition. Rodriguez explained quietly to Daniel and Lieutenant Chen, who had joined them, that the distended abdomen was a classic presentation of kwashiorkor, a form of severe protein energy malnutrition. When the body is deprived of adequate nutrition for extended periods, particularly protein, it begins to fail in multiple ways. The liver can't produce enough albumin, a protein crucial for maintaining proper fluid balance in the body. Without adequate albumin, fluid leaks from blood vessels into body tissues, causing edema and swelling, particularly visible in the abdomen and sometimes the limbs. This swelling is sometimes mistaken for adequate nutrition by those unfamiliar with malnutrition, when it actually indicates the opposite. The body is in crisis and beginning to shut down its normal regulatory processes. Rodriguez estimated, based on the severity of symptoms, that the girl had likely been without adequate food for a minimum of 1 week, possibly longer. The human body, particularly a child's body, can survive remarkable periods without food if it has access to water, but the damage done during that time can be severe and sometimes permanent depending on duration and the child's overall health beforehand. The fact that she was conscious and responsive, even minimally, was actually encouraging and suggested that intervention had come in time to prevent the worst outcomes. An ambulance had been called and was waiting at the dock. The challenge now was moving the girl from the cargo hold to the deck and then down to the waiting emergency vehicle without causing additional stress or potential medical complications. Lieutenant Chen stayed close to the girl, who still hadn't spoken again since her initial whispered statement to Daniel. Chen carefully explained everything that was about to happen. They would help her stand up, support her weight between 2 people, walk slowly to the stairs, and someone would carry her down if walking proved too difficult. There would be a short ride in an ambulance, a special vehicle with medical equipment, to a hospital. Throughout this explanation, Chen maintained eye contact and a gentle, calm voice that seemed to marginally reduce the terror visible in the girl's eyes. When it came time to move, the girl surprised everyone by gripping Daniel's hand with startling intensity. Her small fingers, cold and thin as bird bones, wrapped around his larger hand and held on as if he were the only stable thing in a chaotic world. Daniel didn't hesitate. He scooped her up carefully, mindful of potential injuries and her fragile state, and carried her through the cargo hold, up the metal stairs, and across the deck to the accommodation ladder. She weighed far less than a healthy 8-year-old should, feeling almost weightless in his arms, which both facilitated the carry and served as a heartbreaking reminder of her condition. The girl buried her face against Daniel's uniform shoulder as they moved through the ship, overwhelmed by the sudden presence of so many people and so much activity after days of isolation. As they descended the accommodation ladder to the pier, Daniel spoke continuously, maintaining that calm narration of events, preparing her for each new step. The ambulance doors stood open, revealing the bright, clean interior with its monitoring equipment and supplies. Paramedics Jennifer Morrison and Thomas Kim were ready, having been briefed by radio about the patient they would be transporting. When Daniel tried to set the girl down on the gurney, she refused to release his hand, panic flooding her features. Morrison immediately understood and suggested Daniel ride along to the hospital, which was highly irregular since he wasn't family or an officially assigned child advocate, but was clearly necessary for the girl's emotional stability in this moment. Daniel didn't hesitate, calling back to Lieutenant Chen to handle the scene documentation and crew interviews while he stayed with their victim. The ride to Greystone Memorial Hospital took 15 minutes through morning traffic, with the ambulance using lights but not sirens to avoid additional stress to the patient. Morrison and Kim worked efficiently, establishing an IV line for immediate fluid replacement, placing monitoring leads to track heart rate and oxygen saturation, and covering the girl with heated blankets to address the hypothermia. Throughout these procedures, which would normally cause distress in any patient, but especially a traumatized child, the girl remained eerily silent and still, as if she had learned that compliance and invisibility were survival strategies. Daniel stayed at her side, his hand still held in her grip, talking to her about nothing in particular: the hospital they were going to, the city of Greystone Harbor, the weather, anything to maintain that human connection. At the hospital's emergency entrance, a full trauma team was waiting, alerted by the paramedics' radio call about the incoming pediatric malnutrition case. The girl was immediately transferred to a treatment room, where doctors and nurses descended with professional efficiency, tempered by visible compassion. Dr. Rachel Foster, the emergency room pediatrician on duty, took charge of the case immediately. She performed a rapid but thorough examination, while her team worked to stabilize and treat. The girl's vital signs were concerning but not immediately critical. Heart rate elevated at 110 beats per minute, indicating stress and dehydration. Blood pressure low at 85/50, again suggesting dehydration and poor cardiovascular function. Core temperature at 95.2 degrees Fahrenheit, definitely hypothermic, and respiratory rate slightly elevated at 25 breaths per minute. Dr. Foster's examination revealed no obvious injuries like fractures or bruises, which was encouraging, and suggested that physical violence hadn't been part of this particular horror, though the malnutrition and abandonment were their own form of violence, certainly. Blood tests were ordered immediately to check for electrolyte imbalances, kidney and liver function, blood cell counts, and nutritional markers. The medical team worked with remarkable coordination, each person having a specific role, and executing it while Dr. Foster maintained oversight and called for additional interventions as needed. One of the nurses, an older woman named Helen Ramsey who had decades of pediatric experience, took on the crucial role of emotional support, speaking gently to the girl, explaining each procedure before it happened, maintaining eye contact and physical touch to reinforce that these interventions were care, not harm. At one point during the examination, as nurses were cutting away the girl's soiled clothing to replace it with a clean hospital gown and to fully assess her condition, something fell from the pocket of her shirt and landed on the floor with a soft sound. Helen Ramsey bent to pick it up and found a piece of paper, folded multiple times into a small square and worn soft from repeated handling. She carefully unfolded it while Dr. Foster continued the medical assessment. What she read made her pause, and she quickly handed the note to Dr. Foster, who read it quickly and then looked at the girl with deepened concern. The note was brief, written in handwriting that showed evidence of emotional distress. Letters slightly shaky, some words crossed out and rewritten, the overall impression of someone writing in great pain. The message read, "Can't take care of her anymore. Lost everything after Sarah died. No job, no home, no hope. I'm not enough for her. Please help her get somewhere better than I could give her. She deserves more, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, T." The note confirmed what the circumstances already suggested. This was an abandonment case, not a kidnapping or trafficking situation, though that distinction provided little comfort given the outcome. A father, identified only as T, had deliberately given his daughter to someone else under the belief or hope that she would reach a better situation. The profound failure of imagination and judgment this required was staggering, as was the desperation that must have driven such a decision. Dr. Foster photographed the note carefully with the hospital's documentation camera, ensuring it was preserved as evidence while also keeping the original secure. This note would be crucial for law enforcement and child protective services as they worked to piece together what had happened and identify all parties involved. As the immediate medical crisis was addressed, and the girl's condition began to stabilize with IV fluids and careful warming, Patricia Valdez arrived. Patricia was a senior caseworker with the county's Child Protective Services, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that had seen far too much suffering, but somehow maintained compassion. She conferred quietly with Dr. Foster about the girl's condition and prognosis, then approached the bedside where the girl now lay under warm blankets, still clutching Daniel's hand, though her grip had loosened somewhat as exhaustion and the stress of the morning caught up with her. Patricia pulled up a chair and sat at the girl's eye level, introducing herself calmly and explaining that her job was to help children who had been through scary or hard things, to make sure they were safe and had what they needed. She didn't bombard the girl with questions, instead simply establishing her presence and availability. After several minutes of gentle, non-threatening conversation about neutral topics, like the comfort of the warm blankets and the kindness of the nurses, Patricia carefully asked the simplest and most important question: what was her name? The room fell quiet as everyone waited to see if the girl would respond. For a long moment it seemed she might retreat back into silence. Then, so quietly that Patricia had to lean in to hear, she whispered a single word: Emma. Just Emma. Patricia smiled warmly and repeated the name, welcoming Emma, thanking her for trusting them with her name. She asked carefully about a last name, but Emma either didn't know or wasn't ready to share that information yet. She shook her head slightly and said nothing more. Patricia didn't push, knowing that trust would have to be built slowly and that overwhelming a traumatized child with too many questions would only cause her to shut down further. Instead, Patricia shifted to slightly easier territory, asking about Emma's family. Did she have a mommy or daddy? Where did she live? How old was she? These basic demographic questions sometimes felt easier for children to answer than questions about traumatic events. Emma responded haltingly, her voice barely above a whisper, often pausing for long periods between phrases. She said she had a daddy but didn't know where he was now. She said her mommy went away a long time ago and wasn't coming back, using the euphemism that clearly had been given to her by adults trying to explain death in terms a child might accept. She thought she was 8 years old, or maybe 9, she wasn't completely sure. She remembered living in a house that was small and cold, especially in the winter when the heater thing didn't work. She remembered her daddy sitting at the table with his head in his hands, remembered him using words she didn't understand about money and bills and losing everything. These fragments painted a picture of a family in severe crisis, poverty compounded by loss, an adult unable to cope, and a child trying to make sense of circumstances far beyond her comprehension or control. Patricia listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle follow-up questions, always affirming that Emma was doing well and being very brave. Daniel, still standing at Emma's bedside, found himself struggling to maintain professional detachment. He had responded to countless emergencies in his career with the Coast Guard: boating accidents, drownings, mechanical failures, medical emergencies. He had seen death and suffering in various forms. But something about Emma's quiet acceptance of her abandonment, her learned belief that she didn't deserve to take up space or make noise, struck him with particular force. This wasn't just a failure of one desperate parent. This was a failure of entire support systems that should have caught this family before it reached such a catastrophic point. Over the next 48 hours, Emma remained in the hospital under close medical supervision. Dr. Foster and her team carefully managed Emma's refeeding, which had to be done slowly and cautiously to avoid refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal complication that can occur when nutrition is reintroduced too quickly to someone who has been severely malnourished. The body's metabolism, having adapted to starvation conditions, can be overwhelmed by sudden access to nutrients, causing dangerous shifts in electrolytes and fluid balance that can lead to cardiac arrest or other organ failures. So Emma received small, carefully calculated amounts of liquid nutrition through her IV at first, with gradual introduction of very small amounts of soft, easily digestible food like broth and yogurt, slowly increasing as her body demonstrated it could handle the intake without dangerous metabolic shifts. The dangerous swelling in her abdomen began to gradually decrease as proper nutrition allowed her body to resume more normal fluid regulation. Meanwhile, Daniel returned to the Northern Horizon with his full investigative team to conduct a thorough forensic examination of the ship and interview all personnel. They needed to establish definitively how Emma had gotten aboard, who had placed her there, and whether this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. The ship's captain, Volkov, provided full cooperation, granting access to all areas of the vessel and all documentation. The ship's security footage was particularly valuable, though cargo ships don't have the extensive camera coverage of passenger vessels. There were cameras at certain key points: the gangway, the bridge, the engine room, and some cargo access points, primarily for security against theft. The investigative team spent hours reviewing footage from the departure port of Alexandria, going through every frame of every person who boarded the ship in the days before departure. Finally, they found something significant. 3 days before the Northern Horizon departed Alexandria, a security camera positioned near the cargo loading area captured grainy but usable footage of 2 figures near the containers being loaded onto the ship. The timestamp showed late evening, after most of the main cargo operations had finished, but while a few final items were still being secured. One figure was clearly a man, average height and build, wearing a baseball cap and jacket, though the angle and lighting made facial identification difficult. The other figure was much smaller, child-sized, staying close to the man. The body language suggested apprehension or reluctance. The footage showed the man speaking with someone else, a worker based on his clothing and the equipment visible nearby. There appeared to be an exchange of something between the 2 men, possibly money, though the image quality made it impossible to be certain. Shortly after this exchange, the worker gestured toward one of the cargo access points, and the man led the child in that direction. Subsequent cameras lost track of them as they moved into areas not covered by surveillance. This was their breakthrough. The investigative team froze the clearest frames and began the process of identification. The child in the footage, while not perfectly visible, matched Emma's size and general appearance based on what little could be determined. The worker was more clearly visible in several frames, and port security personnel were able to identify him from employee records as Marcus Chen, a temporary laborer who had been hired specifically for that loading period. Marcus was 32 years old, had an address listed in a nearby neighborhood, and had worked intermittently at the port for about 2 years, usually in short-term positions that didn't require extensive background checks or permanent employment status. When Daniel's team, now working in conjunction with local police due to the criminal nature of the case, attempted to locate Marcus Chen at his listed address, they discovered he had vacated the apartment just days after the Northern Horizon departed. The landlord, a frustrated woman named Mrs. Park, explained that Marcus had paid through the end of the month but had left suddenly with no forwarding information, leaving behind only some basic furniture and a few worthless personal items. Mrs. Park provided access to the apartment, where investigators found little of value: a mattress, a few kitchen items, some old mail. Nothing that provided clear leads to Marcus's current whereabouts. However, the old mail did provide some useful information. There were overdue utility bills, collection notices for credit card debt, and correspondence from temp agencies. Cross-referencing this information with employment records and known associates began to build a picture of Marcus Chen as someone who lived on society's margins, moving frequently, working irregular jobs, likely involved in gray market or illegal activities to supplement legitimate income. An arrest warrant was issued for Marcus Chen on charges of child endangerment and potentially kidnapping or human trafficking, depending on what further investigation revealed. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the state and neighboring states. Port authorities at other locations were notified to watch for him, as his work history suggested he moved between different ports seeking temporary work. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Emma was slowly beginning to open up to Patricia during daily visits. Patricia had learned through years of experience that traumatized children often couldn't or wouldn't tell their stories in linear, complete narratives. Instead, information emerged in fragments, in side comments during other activities, in drawings or play that expressed what words couldn't. Patricia brought art supplies, crayons, markers, paper, and simple toys, creating opportunities for Emma to express herself non-verbally. Over several sessions, Emma began to share pieces of her experience. She drew pictures of a house, small and square, with a window and a door. She drew 3 stick figures, a tall one labeled Daddy, a medium one labeled Mommy, though she crossed that one out, and a small one that was presumably herself. She drew a car that she described as loud and shaky. She talked about a long drive where her daddy kept saying she deserved better things, that he wasn't good enough for her, that she was going to meet nice people. At the time, Emma explained with heartbreaking innocence she had thought they were going on an adventure, maybe to visit relatives or friends. She had felt excited at first. She described arriving at a place with big ships and lots of noise. Her father had seemed very sad and scared, which confused Emma because if they were going somewhere good, why was he upset? At the port, they met a man her father called his friend, though Emma had never seen this man before and felt uncomfortable around him from the beginning. She couldn't articulate why. Children often sense danger or untrustworthiness in ways they can't explain. Emma remembered her father kneeling down and hugging her very tightly, so tightly she could barely breathe. He told her to be brave and strong, that she was going to meet people who would give her nice things and take good care of her. Emma had started to cry, sensing that something was very wrong, begging to stay with him. She remembered clinging to his jacket and him gently but firmly removing her hands. He handed her to the other man, the friend, and Emma watched as her father walked away quickly, not looking back. That was the last time Emma had seen him. The man her father called friend, who Emma would later identify from a photographic lineup as Marcus Chen, had not been kind or reassuring. He grabbed her hand roughly and pulled her toward the ships, telling her harshly to be quiet and stop crying. Emma, already trained by circumstances to believe that making noise or being troublesome led to negative consequences, had swallowed her sobs and tried to comply. Marcus had led her into the cargo area of a ship, though Emma had no way of knowing which ship it was at the time. Everything looked huge and frightening to her small perspective. He pointed to a space between large wooden boxes and told her to sit there and wait. He gave her several bottles of water and a handful of protein bars and crackers that he took from what appeared to be a storage locker. He told her that the ship was going to take her somewhere better, that when the ship stopped, someone would come to get her and take her to a nice family. He warned her sternly not to make noise, not to let the crew find her, or there would be trouble. Then he left, and Emma heard a heavy door close with a finality that terrified her. For the first day, Emma had actually believed what Marcus had told her. She sat in her designated spot, rationing her food and water carefully as she had learned to do during the lean times with her father. She waited for someone to come get her. She listened to the ship's engines start and felt the strange movement as they left port. She waited, but no one came. By the second day, Emma began to understand that something had gone wrong. Either Marcus had lied, or there had been some mistake, but she was not going to be collected and delivered to a nice family. She was alone on a ship heading to an unknown destination. She tried calling out a few times, but her voice was too small to carry over the engine noise and ship operations, and Marcus's warning not to let the crew find her echoed in her mind, making her afraid that if she was discovered, she would somehow be punished. So she endured. She counted in her head to pass the time, a skill her father had taught her as a way to manage anxiety. She made up stories to tell herself. She tried to sleep as much as possible to make the hunger less noticeable. The water bottles ran out after 4 days. The food ran out after 5 days. After that, Emma lost clear track of time. Everything blurred together in a haze of hunger, thirst, fear, and exhaustion. She remembered feeling colder and weaker each day. She remembered that her stomach started to hurt, then felt strangely full even though she hadn't eaten. She remembered that eventually she couldn't really move much anymore, just stayed curled under the thin blanket Marcus had included, holding her stuffed rabbit and drifting in and out of consciousness. She remembered finally not being able to control the crying anymore, her body simply giving in to the physical and emotional anguish. She cried until she had no voice left, until she was making sounds she couldn't control. And miraculously, someone had heard. Someone had come. Someone had cared enough to look for her. That someone had been Daniel, whose gentle voice and steady presence had penetrated the fog of Emma's despair and brought her back from the edge of something much worse than she already experienced. As Patricia listened to Emma's story, emerging in pieces over multiple sessions, she documented everything carefully, knowing this information would be crucial for law enforcement, but also for Emma's own processing and healing. Patricia also coordinated with Dr. Foster and the hospital's child psychologist, Dr. Michael Torres, to ensure Emma received appropriate therapeutic support as she recovered physically. The question of what would happen to Emma after her medical discharge loomed over everyone involved in her care. She clearly could not return to her father, even if he could be located, given the nature of the abandonment. She needed a safe, stable placement where she could continue recovering physically and begin the long process of emotional healing. Patricia reached out to her network of licensed foster families, looking for someone with specific experience in trauma and neglect cases, someone patient and skilled enough to handle Emma's complex needs. Finding the right placement was crucial. The wrong environment could re-traumatize Emma and undo much of the progress she had made. After several conversations and careful vetting, Patricia identified Marianne Hartley as a strong potential placement. Marianne was in her early 60s, a former elementary school teacher who had transitioned into therapeutic foster care after her own children were grown. She had been doing this work for over 15 years and had successfully helped dozens of children who had experienced various forms of trauma, domestic violence, parental substance use, medical neglect, and abandonment. Her home was consistently described by caseworkers and former foster children as warm, structured, and emotionally safe. Patricia arranged for Marianne to visit Emma in the hospital before any placement decision was made, wanting to see how they interacted and whether Emma seemed comfortable. Marianne arrived carrying a small gift, nothing elaborate, just a soft stuffed dog that Emma could keep regardless of whether she came to stay at Marianne's home. She introduced herself simply, explaining that she had a house where children sometimes stayed when they needed a safe place, and that if Emma was interested, there would be a room there for her. Marianne didn't push or make promises beyond her capability to keep. She simply offered presence and possibility. Emma was initially quiet and wary, as she had been with most new people. But Marianne seemed content to sit in silence, occasionally commenting on something neutral, like the view from the hospital window or the flowers another visitor had brought. After about 20 minutes, Emma asked softly if Marianne's house had enough food. The question, so poignant in its reflection of Emma's recent trauma, clearly moved Marianne, though she kept her emotional response measured. She answered honestly that yes, her house had plenty of food, that there was a refrigerator and pantry that were kept full, that children who stayed with her were welcome to eat whenever they were hungry. Emma considered this information seriously, then asked if the house was warm. Marianne confirmed that it was, that there was heating in the winter and cooling in the summer, that Emma would have her own room with a comfortable bed and warm blankets. Emma nodded slowly, processing this information. After another period of thoughtful silence, she asked one more question. If she went to Marianne's house, would she be left there alone? Marianne understood the core of Emma's fear and addressed it directly. She explained that no, Emma would not be left alone. Marianne would be there, and there were rules she had to follow as a foster parent that included always making sure children in her care were safe and supervised. She acknowledged that Emma had been through something very scary, where adults didn't keep her safe, and that it made sense to be worried it might happen again. But Marianne promised, and Patricia, who was present, confirmed, that there were systems and people checking regularly to make sure foster children were being taken care of properly. Emma seemed to accept this explanation, or at least accept that she didn't have better options available. She agreed to go to Marianne's house when the doctors said she was ready to leave the hospital. That breakthrough came 10 days after Emma's rescue. Dr. Foster confirmed that Emma had made remarkable physical progress. Her electrolytes had normalized, her hydration was restored, her body temperature was stable, and she had begun to gain a small amount of healthy weight, as opposed to the pathological fluid retention that had caused the abdominal swelling. The swelling itself had resolved almost completely with proper nutrition. While Emma still had a long road ahead for full physical recovery, she no longer required hospital-level care. The discharge plan was carefully coordinated between medical, social services, and mental health professionals. Emma would go to Marianne's home with a detailed care plan that included nutritional guidelines, medical follow-up appointments, and the beginning of regular therapy sessions with Dr. Torres. Patricia would conduct home visits weekly initially, then bi-weekly as Emma settled in, to ensure the placement was working well for everyone. On the day of discharge, Daniel came to the hospital to say goodbye and to give Emma his contact information. He explained that his job meant he couldn't visit often, but that he wanted her to know she could always reach him if she needed help, or just wanted to talk to someone who understood what had happened. Emma surprised him by asking if she could hug him. Daniel, deeply moved, knelt down and let Emma wrap her thin arms around his neck. She whispered a quiet thank you, and Daniel responded that she never had to thank him, that he was just glad he could help, that she was incredibly brave. As Marianne and Patricia prepared to take Emma to her new temporary home, Dr. Foster and the nursing staff who had cared for Emma gathered to say goodbye. Nurse Helen Ramsey, who had been particularly attentive throughout Emma's stay, gave her a gentle hug and reminded her that she had been one of the bravest patients Helen had ever cared for. The transition out of the hospital and into Marianne's home went more smoothly than anyone dared hope. Marianne's house was a modest but well-maintained ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and well-kept lawns. Emma's room had been prepared carefully, painted a soft neutral cream color, furnished with a twin bed covered in a cheerful quilt, a small dresser, a bookshelf with some age-appropriate books, and a desk near the window. There were no posters or decorations yet. Marianne explained that Emma could choose how to decorate her space, as she felt comfortable. The room represented possibility, without overwhelming Emma with choices or expectations. The first few weeks in Marianne's home were an adjustment period marked by small victories and occasional setbacks. Emma struggled initially to accept that food was freely available. She would eat very small amounts at meals, then later be found carefully checking the kitchen to confirm that food was indeed still there and available. Marianne handled this with remarkable patience, never expressing frustration, simply reinforcing through repetition and consistency that there was always enough food, that Emma could eat when hungry, that Marianne's job was to make sure Emma had what she needed. Gradually, very gradually, Emma began to trust this reality. She started eating slightly larger portions. She stopped hoarding food in her room. She even began to express preferences about what she liked to eat, a sign of returning to normal childhood development, where having opinions and preferences is expected, rather than dangerous. Sleep was another challenge. Emma had nightmares frequently, waking, crying, or frightened. Marianne would hear her through the monitor she kept in Emma's room and would come quickly to provide comfort, sitting with Emma until she calmed enough to sleep again. They developed a routine. Marianne would read to Emma before bed, stories carefully selected to be comforting and predictable, then leave a small nightlight on and keep her door slightly open so Emma wouldn't feel trapped or isolated in the darkness. School enrollment was delayed initially to allow Emma time to stabilize emotionally and physically. When she did begin attending the local elementary school about 6 weeks after coming to live with Marianne, it was on a very gradual schedule, just 2 hours per day at first, slowly increasing as Emma demonstrated she could handle the social and academic demands. Her teachers were briefed on her situation, without unnecessary details, but with enough information to understand that Emma needed extra patience and support. Emma was significantly behind academically, having missed substantial schooling during the period of family crisis and homelessness that preceded her abandonment. But she was intelligent and motivated, and with tutoring support and her own determination, she began to make progress. Meanwhile, the investigation into Emma's case continued. The search for Thomas Whitfield, Emma's father, had expanded across multiple states. Investigators compiled information from various sources: the abandoned farmhouse where neighbors reported the family had lived, county social services records showing Thomas's inquiries about assistance, medical records from Sarah Whitfield's illness and death, employment records tracking Thomas's job loss, and financial records showing the family's economic collapse. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking in its predictability. Thomas Whitfield had been a farm equipment mechanic, skilled and reliable, earning modest but sufficient income. His wife Sarah had worked part-time at a school cafeteria, contributing to household finances while also being available for Emma during after-school hours. They lived frugally but comfortably in a rental farmhouse, managing to meet their needs without much margin for emergencies. 3 years before Emma's rescue, Sarah began experiencing symptoms that were initially dismissed as stress or minor illness. By the time she sought medical care and received a diagnosis, her condition had progressed significantly. The specific illness was never fully clear from records, but it required ongoing treatment, specialist care, and medications. The Whitfield family had minimal health insurance, the kind of high-deductible, catastrophic-only plan that is affordable in monthly premiums, but provides little actual coverage for chronic illness. Medical debt mounted rapidly. Sarah tried to continue working as long as possible, needing both the income and the sense of normalcy, but her declining health made it increasingly difficult. She passed away 18 months before Emma was found on the ship, leaving Thomas shattered and the family finances in ruins. Thomas attempted to continue working, but profound grief compounded by what was likely major depression made it nearly impossible to function. He missed work frequently, his performance suffered, and he eventually lost his job. Without income, the already insurmountable medical debt was joined by mounting unpaid rent, utilities, and basic living expenses. Eviction proceedings began. Thomas made attempts to seek help. County records showed he had contacted social services twice, inquiring about assistance programs. He had specifically asked about temporary foster care, not because he wanted to permanently give up his daughter, but because he wanted to ensure she had food and shelter while he tried to get back on his feet. However, navigating the social services system is complex under the best circumstances, nearly impossible when someone is dealing with untreated depression, poverty, and acute crisis. Applications required documentation Thomas didn't have or couldn't locate. Appointments were scheduled weeks out. The processes moved slowly while Thomas's situation deteriorated rapidly. In desperation, Thomas had apparently sought alternative solutions outside official channels. Exactly how he connected with Marcus Chen remained unclear, but it was likely through the informal networks that exist among people living in poverty, word-of-mouth connections about who can help with problems the official system can't or won't address quickly. Marcus had apparently presented himself as someone who could help, who knew people in other places looking to adopt or provide care for children, who could facilitate a quick placement that would give Emma a better life. Whether Marcus actually believed this or was simply exploiting Thomas's desperation was unknown, but the result was the same. Emma hidden in a cargo hold, nearly dying. 2.5 months after Emma's rescue, the search for Thomas finally produced results. A bus station employee in a city 400 miles from where Emma had been found recognized Thomas from a photo distributed through a law enforcement bulletin. The employee, a night shift worker named Jerome, reported that a man matching Thomas's description had been hanging around the station for several weeks, sometimes sleeping in corners, occasionally doing odd jobs for small amounts of cash, generally existing in the marginal space of people without stable housing. Local police were notified and officers were dispatched to the bus station. They found Thomas exactly where Jerome had indicated, sitting on a bench with a small backpack containing all his possessions, looking significantly older and more worn than in the photos that were now months out of date. When officers Martinez and Johnson approached and identified themselves, Thomas didn't run or resist. He simply looked up with an expression that officers later described as relief mixed with profound despair. Before the officers even said why they were there, Thomas asked about Emma. Was she alive? Was she okay? Where was she now? Officer Martinez, following training for dealing with distressed individuals, confirmed that Emma had been found, that she was alive and receiving care. Thomas's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He collapsed on the bench, sobbing with a grief and relief so profound that both officers were visibly moved, despite their professional experience with difficult situations. Thomas was taken into custody, not roughly or with excessive force, but with an understanding that this was a man who had already been destroyed by circumstances and his own terrible choices. At the police station, Thomas waived his right to an attorney initially, too overwhelmed and guilt-ridden to think about his own legal protection. He simply wanted to know everything about Emma, where she was, how she had been found, was she getting enough food? Did she have a safe place to stay? Was she being taken care of properly? Detective Sarah Monahan, who had been assigned to Emma's case, confirmed all these details, while also beginning the difficult interview process to understand exactly what had led to this situation. Over several hours, with breaks for food and rest, Thomas provided a full account of his actions. He explained Sarah's death, the medical debt, losing his job, the eviction, the overwhelming sense of failure as a father and provider. He described trying to seek help through official channels and feeling overwhelmed by the complexity and slowness of the systems. He admitted that he had heard about Marcus through another desperate parent at a shelter, someone who said Marcus had helped them find a better placement for their child. Thomas acknowledged that he knew it was risky, that he had serious doubts, but that he had convinced himself it was Emma's only chance at a decent life. He described Marcus's promises that Emma would be taken to a city with better social services, that Marcus knew people who helped place children with families, that Emma would be safe and cared for. Thomas admitted he hadn't asked enough questions, hadn't demanded to know specific details, because deep down he knew that if he looked too closely, he would see the plan for the desperate fantasy it was. He explained that he genuinely believed, or had convinced himself to believe, that giving Emma to Marcus was an act of love rather than an act of abandonment. Thomas had no idea Marcus planned to put Emma on a cargo ship. Marcus had told him they would drive to the destination city, that the journey would take a couple of days. Thomas had spent what little money he had left to pay Marcus for his help, essentially paying for his daughter's abandonment. After leaving Emma with Marcus at the port, Thomas had walked away quickly, forcing himself not to look back because he knew if he saw her face he wouldn't be able to go through with it. He had immediately been overwhelmed with doubt and regret, but didn't know how to undo what he had done. He didn't know Marcus's last name, phone number, or specific plans.